But let's start with the Prime Minister, shall we, who's arrived in the United States to hold vital talks with President Joe Biden to decide whether Ukraine can use British long-range missiles inside Russia.
So Keir Starmer will appeal to Mr Biden to agree that decision. It would mark a significant gain for Ukraine.
But on the other hand, the risk of an all-out conflict suddenly looks more likely, with President Putin promising the decision will trigger a war with the US and the UK. GBNews political correspondent Katherine Forster has more.
The Prime Minister back in Washington D.C. It's only a couple of months since he was here at the NATO summit, which was less than a week after he swept to that huge landslide victory in early July. This time, he has come to talk with the outgoing US President, Joe Biden. Joe Biden, of course, will only be president till November the 5th. After that, well, at the moment, it's simply too close to call whether it will be the return of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. We simply do not know. But in the meantime, the UK and the US very keen to work together to strengthen their special relationship that we hear so much about in the face of very, very pressing global challenges. The situation in Ukraine, of course, and also in the Middle East. Now, the Foreign Secretary is with the Prime Minister. He, of course, is back from a trip to Ukraine that he took with the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Vladimir Zelensky has made it plain what further help he wants from the West. One of the things is the ability to use British and French-made Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles and to send them into Russia itself. Now, that is something that up until now the US has been against. It sounds like that position is beginning to shift. We may hear a change in the coming days or weeks. But President Putin of Russia has had something to say about that possibility. Speaking on Russian television, he said that if that happened, that would mean that NATO countries were at war with Russia and that Russia would then have to respond. So very worrying indeed. Now, on the plane over, us journalists were talking to the Prime Minister. We mentioned this, and in response, he said, well, look, Russia started the war. They illegally invaded Ukraine. It's in their power to stop the war now. But this is obviously incredibly delicate. The US has been very worried about the possible risks of escalation. But of course, we now know that Iran is supplying missiles to Russia. So the view is that Russia has already escalated this. They'll also be talking about the Middle East, the need for the ceasefire, the need to see the hostages released. No immediate prospect of that at the moment, it must be said.
That was Katherine Forster for us in Washington. Now, joining us now is John Oxley, the political commentator. John Oxley, thank you for joining us today. How worried are you, about the prospect of war with Russia?
I think it's something we always have to be cautious about how delicate this situation is. But, through the last 2.5 years, when we've been supporting Ukraine, we've had these threats time and time again from President Putin. We've had this Russian saber rattling. They have, on their equivalent of GBNews, every evening they show visuals of missiles flying towards London. And what we have actually seen is very little escalation has actually happened when we have done these things that they've threatened. But also, Russia has been escalating in its own way across Europe through, spying, through sabotage. And, we need to be conscious that, this only really goes away if Russia is defeated on the battlefield. And that means giving Ukraine, the support it needs to achieve its military objectives. So I think overall, we've heard all this before from Russia, and I'm not sure there's that much new to be concerned about.
Why now in all of this, John Oxley? Because Zelensky has been asking for this permission to use Storm Shadow missiles for months now. Why now are we seeing these crunch talks, if you like, between the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, and Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and now we've got the President and the Prime Minister get involved in these conversations?
I think it's partly to do with, how the war has been progressing recently, some of the successes that Ukraine has had on the battlefield, but also some of the setbacks that Ukraine has had. There's more and more evidence of the support that is coming to Russia from its own proxies, places like Iran, places like North Korea that are helping them be replenished with offensive weapons. We've seen some quite horrendous raids on Ukrainian cities using those missiles and drones recently. And I suspect also there is concern about where all this goes if suddenly it is President Trump sitting in the White House in January. The Republicans have been very skeptical about supporting Ukraine. And I suspect there is a chance that there's a sort of pressure that if we get these decisions made now, they become harder to reverse. Yes. But it means Ukraine gets the support before someone who might be slower about it comes in.
John, how much of this is being driven by legacy, do you think? We've got this lame duck US president over there. We've got Sir Keir Starmer in Washington today, having talks all day with him. There'll be a meeting later, probably in the Oval Office. To what extent is policy being driven by one man's idea to make sure that he cements support for Ukraine if Donald Trump wins in November? And how risky is that for us in Britain?
I'm not sure it's about that. I mean, I think one of the things is the Biden administration has been relatively cautious about support for Ukraine, compared with some of the things that Britain, some of the European allies have been doing. But I think this is more from a strategic sense that if NATO is going to be weakened, if Ukraine is going to be weakened by a new president, which from a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party and its advisors in the run-up to the election, that looks to be the case. Then from a strategic perspective, you need to get as many decisions made and as much support given ahead of those conversations changing in tone after the November election, or indeed the sort of January transfer of power.
And John, of course, this all comes back to, doesn't it, defence spending. David Lammy is saying it's a shame that defence spending was ever cut from 2.5% of GDP. Of course, the Tories had it, didn't they, the target of 2030 that would be back at 2.5 GDP. But Labour are yet to set that time frame. And this is putting pressure on the Treasury before the budget in October.
Yes, and this is the problem we have. It would be great to have defence spending higher, but we are seeing, across the board, there are a lot of, departments pushing for more spending. There is only limited room for manoeuvre with tax, and the money has to come from somewhere. And it's great to have a long shopping list, but we need to be realistic about what can be afforded and what politically is the best option. Because if you're a government making decisions, well, when it comes down to it, people care more about their local hospital than an abstract concept like defence.
And just John Oxley, just finally, do you think there's a point at which MPs may want to get involved, maybe a vote in the House of Commons on escalating UK involvement in Ukraine? And we saw that how divisive that was over Iraq back in the 2000s.
I'm not sure at this stage we'll be having a vote like that. And, those votes tend to be when British troops are committed in some way. At the moment, there's nothing like that on the cards. I think this will come up around some of the debates around defence spending and foreign policy, but it remains the case that within Westminster and within the British public, there's quite a lot of consensus around the level of support that we are giving to Ukraine at the moment.
OK, John Oxley, good to see you this morning. I think we're seeing you in an hour, so we'll see you then.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.